Previously on Wentworth, Boomer was taken to the hospital to have her next scan, where it was discovered that she is having twin girls, and she is actually closer to 6 months rather than 4 months than she originally thought. Will received a bombshell that Sandy Edwards is actually his daughter from a previous fling from a very long time ago. Everyone was horrified by the state that Vera was in, but Joan managed to help Vera break out of her catatonic state, where they had a heart-to-heart, and Joan is planning on getting Vera out of Sinclair. But what does this mean for her revenge plan with Dr. Miller and Mr. Jackson? Lou and Trav ended up at a motel to keep their heads down, but a pizza delivery guy recognized Lou and telephoned the police. And Rita challenged Nola Mackenzie to a fight, where Rita beat Nola to death in front of the women. What followed was the women setting fire to Blackmore, and everything turned into chaos. Rita went down to solitary to save her sister Ruby, but Craven shot Ruby and Ruby died in Rita's arms. Craven then went to shoot Rita, but the underground solitary ceilings collapsed, landing on top of both Rita and Craven, and an explosion ripped through Blackmore. Over at Wentworth, and the H1 girls are watching a news report on the TV. Multiple fires have broken out at Blackmore. It's not clear at this stage if this was caused by a riot or just a tragic accident. The number of casualties are still unknown at this stage. However, the prisoners at Blackmore are being transferred to alternative prisons. Ali and Boomer then look at each other, and Ali says, "Shit, Booms, Ruby and Rita are both there, and Miss Bennett." And Boomer says, "I know, but they will be okay, won't they?" And Ali says, "I really hope so, Booms. Let's keep our fingers crossed that they all get sent back here." Sandy then says, "This Rita, wasn't she the top dog here?" And Boomer says, "Yeah, she was voted in not long after the explosion, and she's a great top dog." Margot then says, "Well, from what I hear, this Rita used to be a copper." Sandy then says, "Is that right?" And Ali says, "Yeah, she used to be a copper, but she came in here to do a job on one person only. Trust me guys, Rita is the best friend you could ever want in here, and I certainly wouldn't want to mess with her. She's the one who broke out of here and took Denise to the roof." And Sandy says, "Oh, so that's Rita. Okay, well, ex-copper or not, she sounds badass. I'm looking forward to meeting her." In Will's office, and the minister is there, telling Will that at least half of the prisoners in Blackmore are coming to Wentworth. And Will is like, "Where the hell are we gonna put them all?" And the minister says, "That's up to you to decide, Mr. Jackson. Move the women around and double up the units. Just make it work." Will then asks, "So do we know how this fire started?" And the minister says, "Well, everything is a little sketchy at the moment, but it's looking like the women might have rioted and set fires all around the prison. As to what or why is still yet to be investigated." Will then asks, "So is there any news on Connors or Mitchell?" And the minister says, "Mitchell was killed and Connors has been taken to the hospital under very close guard." And Will is like, "Oh my god, what the hell happened to Mitchell?" And the minister says, "Like I just said, Mr. Jackson, the details are very sketchy. The fire at the prison hasn't even been fully put out yet, so let's save the questions for later. Your top priority is to get everything ready for these transfers." Janet Latham is in the staff room trying to make phone calls to Blackmore, trying to find out if her sister Chrissy is okay, but she can't get hold of any Blackmore officers or Craven, and she's in a little bit of a panic. We then cut to the motel where Lou and Trav are staying, and they see the news on the report on Blackmore. Lou turns around and says, "Bloody hell, it's all going off in Blackmore today." Lou then walks over to look out the window, and she sees a load of police cars arriving. And Lou's like, "Shit, there's a load of cop cars outside." And Trav says, "Oh no, what are we gonna do?" And Lou says, "Just sit tight, little brother." And Trav goes on to say, "I can't go to prison, Lou. The people who I owe money to, they will torture me in prison. And Lou says, look, just shut it for a second, let me think. More and more police guards then turn up, surrounding the building. Back in the prison, and the officers are bringing in extra beds into every unit, and everyone is getting ready to double up with the Blackmore intake. Margot shouts out, I don't want to share with anyone, and Jake says, you've got no choice, Gaffney. Maxine then asks Mr. Stewart if she can double up with Boomer so that she can look after her, and Jake says, yep, that's totally fine, Conway. And Boomer shouts out, yes, Maxie, oh, we're gonna have so much fun together. Ali then asks if there's any word of Rita and Ruby, and Jake says, sorry Novak, I don't have any news at the moment. Sandy then says, wow, the women must have made a real mess of Blackmore if they're transferring everyone to different prisons, and Ali says, yeah, I just hope Rita and Ruby are okay. Janet comes running to tell Jake that some of the first transfer vans are arriving now, so we need everyone down at reception, and Jake says, yep, okay, no worries, give me 2 minutes and I'll be straight down. Over at Vera's empty house, and someone's picking the lock of the back door and breaks in. We see some black leather gloves, and of course, it's Joan Ferguson. Joan walks around Vera's empty house, walking through every single room. She goes into baby Grace's room and she sees some loose photographs on the side of Grace and takes one. She then walks into the living room and looks up at the fan on the ceiling. Joan then moves the sofa so she can climb up to the fan, and Joan then installs a small hidden camera. She then looks at her phone to make sure that the camera covers the whole of the living room. Joan smiles and then moves the sofa back and leaves Vera's house. At Wentworth, and multiple transfer vans are arriving, and a load of Blackmore prisoners are at the intake reception. Janet comes running down and is discreetly looking around for her sister Chrissy, but she can't find her. Janet then sees some of the Blackmore officers and starts chatting with them. What the hell happened, says Janet. Where's Craven? And the officer says, Craven has been rushed to hospital. He was found underneath a load of rubble in the solitary bark, and he's not in a very good way at the moment. So Janet's like, well, what happened then? What sparked off this fire? And the officer says it was Rita Connors. She orchestrated some of the women to start fires all around Blackmore while she killed Mackenzie in the yard during a fight. And Janet then asks, so what's happened to Connors now? And the officer says she's also in hospital. She was found not too far from Craven. A bunch of new inmates are then escorted into Wentworth, and Janet then sees her sister Chrissy covered in dirt from the smoke, but she's looking okay. Janet goes over and whispers to Chrissy, are you okay? And Chrissy says, yeah, I'm fine. And Janet says, okay, good. I'll come and see you later once you've been given your unit. Back at the motel, and the police have the motel surrounded. One of the cops gets on a megaphone and tells Lou and Trav to give themselves up. Lou is then like, oh, for fuck's sake, I can't believe this is happening. And Trav then says, I can't do it, sis, I can't. They will torture me in prison. What are we going to do? Lou turns around and says, will you calm down, baby brother? And Trav says, no, I can't calm down, sis. I just can't go to jail. I can't. Trav then grabs the gun from the bed, and Lou says, whoa, now little brother, what are you doing? And Trav says, we're gonna have to shoot our way out of here, sis. And Lou says, are you crazy? Have you seen how many coppers are out there? You will not last 2 seconds. Another announcement comes over the megaphone saying, this is your final chance. Come out now with your hands up. Trav then panics and starts to break down to Lou, saying, I can't do it, Lou. You have no idea who these people are who are after me. They will torture me to death. I just can't do it. Lou then says, okay, Trav, look, just calm down. Nothing is going to happen to you. And then Trav says, you don't understand, Lou. This is it for me now. I can't let them take me to prison. I'm sorry, Lou. Trav then points the gun to his head and shoots himself in front of his sister, with blood flying all over her and the room. Lou screams out, no, and runs to her brother's body and starts screaming, crying. The police then burst in and find Lou cradling her dead brother. The coppers quickly grab the gun from the floor, and the detective comes in and sees the carnage. Lou then continues to cradle her brother in her arms. Chrissy and a few of the Blackmore prisoners are escorted to H1 by Jake. They arrive at H1 and Jake introduces everyone to each other. Sandy then shouts out, "Hey, Chrissy!" Chrissy's like, "Oh, Sandy, I heard you were shoved up in here." And Jake says, "I'm glad you two know each other because you two are going to be sharing." And Sandy's like, "Oh yes, thank you, Mr. Stewart." So, the Blackmore women settle in with H1, and Sandy, Boomer, Ali, Maxie all ask Chrissy what happened. And Chrissy says, "Oh, you won't believe it, girls, but your top dog Rita, she got a load of us to start fires all around the prison, and she killed Nola Mackenzie, she was the previous top dog, in a fight in the yard in front of everyone." And Ali says, "Why did Rita want everyone to start fires in the prison?" And Chrissy says, "Well, Rita told me and Mouse that Craven and Nola were pumping Ruby up with heroin." Boomer then shouts out, "What? No, not our Ruby. Why would they do that?" Chrissy says, "I have no idea. Craven is a madman. Well, Rita wanted us to destroy Blackmore, so we would all be transferred to decent prisons and to stop Craven's regime." Sandy then says, "Where is Mouse, Chrissy?" And Chrissy says, "Mouse is dead. We were trying to break into solitary to get Ruby while Rita was fighting with Nola, and Craven and Carlson caught us, and Craven then grabbed Mouse and threw her down a flight of stairs. That bastard just wiped her out in front of me." Sandy then says, "Oh, that fucking Craven, he is evil. I hope Craven got his." And Chrissy says, "I'm not sure. I did hear some screws talking and Craven has been rushed into hospital, but I don't know how bad he is." Sandy says, "Well, let's hope the bastard rots. We don't want him coming here." Ali then says, "So where is Rita and Ruby now?" And Chrissy turns around and says, "I honestly don't know, girls." Boomer then gets very angry and says, "I've had enough of this shit. I'm looking for a screw. I want to know where they are." And Boomer then storms off. Back at the motel, and Lou is in the back of the police car in handcuffs, looking absolutely broken at what has just happened. She watches her baby brother being taken into the back of an ambulance in a body bag with tears in her eyes, and she whispers, "I'm sorry, baby brother." Over at Sinclair, and Joan is on duty. She goes in to see Vera to see how she is. And Vera says, "I'm okay. Jake is coming to see me tomorrow. I thought I'd better give you the heads up so you don't get recognised." Joan then pulls out a photo of baby Grace and gives it to Vera. Joan says, "I wanted you to have this." Vera then bursts into tears and tells Joan that she misses her so much. And Joan says, "I know you do, Vera, and Grace needs her mother. What if I could get you out of here, Vera?" And Vera says, "What do you mean, Joan?" And Joan says, "I know someone who can get you some fake passports. What if I get you and Grace out of the country so you can have a fresh start?" Vera says, "Don't be silly, Joan. There's no way that can happen." And Joan says, "Yes, Vera, I can do it." But Vera says that I cannot do that to Jake. I can't take Grace away from her dad. Joan then pauses and then says, "What if Jake came with you?" And Vera says, "Do you really think Jake is going to trust you, Joan? He's actually terrified of you. The moment he sees that you're alive, he will call the cops." Joan says, "Not if we talk to him together in here tomorrow. We can talk to him together and soften the blow." And Vera says, "Oh, I don't know, Joan." And Joan says, "Look, Vera, you killed a prisoner in front of many witnesses. Even if you don't spend the rest of your life in Sinclair, it's going to be years until you see Grace again. You're going to miss the best years of her life if you do not take this chance. You don't deserve this, Vera. Please let me help you because this really is the only way." Vera then looks up at Joan and says, "Why would you help me, Joan?" And Joan says, "You know why, Vera. Because I care about you." Back at Wentworth, and the minister is with Will, telling him that Lou Kelly has been captured and will be coming back to Wentworth once the police are finished with her. The minister tells him that Luke Kelly is to go straight to the slot when she returns until a visiting justice can be brought in to determine the amount of time she should be locked away, and that he is recommending a permanent stay in isolation. Will then says, "Okay, Minister, any news on Connors yet?" And the minister says, yes, Connors has been given a clean bill of health and will be back today. The same is to happen to Connors. I want her in the slot when she gets back. And Will says, "But Minister, she's just lost her sister." And the minister says, "I don't care, Mr. Jackson, I don't care. The amount of trouble that Connors has caused, I want her locked away and isolated for the moment." Boomer storms up to Officer Janet Latham, demanding to know where Rita and Ruby is. Janet tells Boomer to be careful how she speaks to an officer, and Boomer says, "I don't care, I want to know where the hell Ruby is. Ruby is my best friend." Janet turns around and says, "Mitchell is dead, Jenkins. She was killed in the fire. Now piss off and leave me alone." Boomer then starts to cry by herself as Janet walks down the corridor. The women are in the dining room having food. The Blackmore women cannot believe how much nicer the food is in Wentworth. Chrissy sits down with some of the H1 girls. Boomer then comes running into the dining room in tears. Maxine gets up and comforts Boomer, asking her what the matter is, and Boomer turns to the women and says, "Ruby, she's dead." And everyone in the dining room gasps, and Ali's like, "What? No, she can't be dead." And Boomer says, "She is. Fucking Miss Latham just took great delight in telling me." Chrissy then has a worried look on her face as Boomer sits down at the table with them all. Boomer then looks up at Chrissy and says, "Hey, your surname is Latham too." And Chrissy looks a little bit shifty and says, "Yeah, what of it?" And Boomer says, "Is she related to you or summit?" And Chrissy says, "Don't be silly, of course not, it's just coincidence." And Boomer says, "Oh, she's a fucking bitch. She took great pleasure when she just told me about Ruby." Sandy then stands up and says, "Right, I've had enough of this. What are the officers trying to do? Start a riot? I'm going to speak to Mr. Jackson right now." Sandy then storms out of the dining room. Will is in his office and has just had a phone call telling him that Rita Connors has just left the hospital and is on her way back to Wentworth. Jake knocks the door and comes in, telling him that Edwards would like to see him. Will then has a little bit of a shocked look on his face for a moment but says, "Okay, bring her in." Sandy comes in and says, "Mr. Jackson, maybe you can tell me why you didn't inform the girls that Ruby Mitchell has been killed." And Will then says, "How did you know about that?" And Sandy says, "Officer Latham took it upon herself to tell Boomer, and not only did she tell her, but she also took great delight in it too." Will then says, "Oh, I'm sorry, I was gonna get all the women together later and tell them all." Sandy just turns around and says, "It's not good enough, Mr. Jackson, you should have told the girls as soon as you found out. Look, I didn't know Ruby, but she meant a lot to the women." And Will says, I know, I'm sorry, things have been very crazy today." So Sandy says, "Well, maybe you can do something about Officer Latham. She shouldn't be stirring the women like that, especially with Boomer. She's heavily pregnant, for goodness sake." And Will says, "Yes, I know, don't worry, I will be having words with Miss Latham. She shouldn't have done it, so leave it with me." And Sandy says, "Okay, Mr. Jackson, well, thank you." Sandy then goes to get up to leave, but then Will says, "So, I saw you had words with your mum the other day." And Sandy says, "What's it got to do with you, Mr. Jackson?" And Will says, "I'm just checking that you're okay." Sandy says, "I'm fine. My mother has always been bad news. I'm glad that I'm dead to her now. Now, can I please go, Mr. Jackson?" Will then says, "Yes, you can go," and Jake comes in to escort Sandy back. Will's phone then rings. Connors has arrived. Will goes down to reception to see Rita as she's brought in, and Rita is looking broken and angry. Rita says to Will, "Have you heard about Ruby?" And Will says, "Yes, I have, Rita. Look, I'm really sorry, but the minister has instructed me to send you to the slot for the time being." Rita then says, "Did you hear about how she died?" Mr. Jackson. She was murdered by Governor Craven. As Rita is saying all this, Jake arrives on the scene, and Rita goes on to say that Craven shot and killed Ruby in revenge for Detective Jonesy. They've been working together. And Will says, I can't believe that, Rita. And Rita says, when have I ever lied to you, Mr. Jackson? I've always been open and honest with you. Craven killed my little sister, and he also ordered the attack on Vera too. Jake then says, what do you mean Craven ordered the attack? And Rita says, he told his bit on the side and her friends to gang rape Vera. That's why Vera is now in the nut house. And Will then says, okay Rita, look, you're gonna have to be taken down to solitary now, and I will come and see you when you've calmed down. And Rita is then taken away. Jake then goes up to Will and says, do you think it's true? And Will says, I have no idea, Jake. Maybe you should ask Vera when you see her tomorrow. And Jake says, oh, I will be. Will then says, I've had enough today. Do you fancy a drink after work? Jake says, I can't. I'm picking Grace up straight after my shift. And Will then says, well, how about I cook us some food and we can drown our sorrows when Grace goes to bed? And Jake says, okay, big man, you're the boss. Chrissy is in the shower block on her own, and Janet comes to see her. Chrissy says, what the hell do you think you're doing, upsetting Boomer and the women like that? And Janet says, what are you talking about now, Chris? Boomer wanted to know what happened to Mitchell. And Chrissy says, yeah, she did, but you didn't have to do it like that, for God's sake. The women nearly twigged that we are sisters. You don't have to make things harder for me in here, mind. And Janet says, okay, I'm sorry. It's just the prisoners really piss me off most of the time. And Chrissy says, well, if you don't like it, then why are you here? Janet says, you know why I became a prison officer, to protect you. And Chrissy says, well, you're doing a shit job, Janet. Just do me a favour and stop pissing the women off, because otherwise it's going to be me that's going to get it in the neck. And Chrissy then storms off. A little bit later, and Janet is walking down the corridor and bumps into Maxine. Maxine says, can I have a word please, Miss Latham? Janet says, what do you want, Conway? And Maxine says, just a little bit of advice. If you ever upset Boomer again, you'll have me to deal with. Janet then says, who the hell do you think you are, Conway, speaking to an officer like that? And Maxine says, I mean it, Miss Latham, leave Boomer alone. Janet then says, right, you're going down the slot for being abusive to an officer. And Janet drags Maxine down to the slot and is put in the cell next to Rita. It's night time, and Jake and Will are having dinner at Vera's house with a few drinks. Jake tells Will that he can't wait to see Vera tomorrow, and Will says make sure you send her my love and don't forget to ask her about the Craven thing. If it's true, then I don't want him coming to Wentworth to work with me. And Jake says, do you think it's true though, what Connor said? And Will says, I take nothing for granted anymore, Jake. I mean, just look at Ferguson. She was a screw loose and I never saw it coming when she was governor at Wentworth. Joan is actually watching Will and Jake's conversation through the camera on the fan on her phone. Jake then says, yeah, Ferguson is one thing, but organising a ganging, I mean, that is just beyond sick. Will says, just try and get the truth with Vera tomorrow, but try not to upset her. And Jake says, I won't. Do you know what, Will? I still love her, mind. I don't think I've ever stopped loving her. I just hope that there's something I can do to help her tomorrow. And Will says, I'm sure you will, Jake. Jake then asks Will if he's really okay, because he's looking a little bit down. And Will then stops eating and looks at Jake and says, if I tell you something, you've got to promise me that you won't say anything to anyone. And Jake says, yeah, of course, you got my word. So Will eases in across the table and says, Sandy Edwards is my daughter. Joan is still watching this from her mobile phone and her mouth drops. Jake then coughs and says, you what? Your daughter? And Will says, I know, it's mad, but I had a thing with her mum a very, very long time ago and she told me the other day at visiting. And Jake says, wow, so what are you gonna do? And Will says, I have no idea, Jake. I mean, I didn't even know she was mine until the other day. I always wanted my own family. I was trying for kids with my wife years ago before she was killed. And I just can't turn my back on Sandy. I just can't. We then cut to Rita in the slot in the dead of night, who is crying and singing the same chant that she was singing for Ruby back in season 7. As she's singing, Maxine is next door listening to all of it, and Maxine has got tears in her eyes. As Rita stops the singing, Maxine then talks through the air vent and says, "That was beautiful." Rita then asks, "Who's that?" And Maxine says, "My name's Maxine. We've never met, but I've heard loads about you. I was very sorry to hear about Ruby." And Rita says, "Oh, it's all around the prison already, is it?" And Maxine says, "Well, this bitch officer told Boomer, and that's kind of the reason why I'm down here now." And Rita says, "Do the women know what happened?" And Maxine says, "No, all we know is that she was killed in the fire." And Rita says, "No, she was murdered. Murdered by the governor of Blackmore. He shot her right in front of me, and he was going to shoot me as well, just before the ceiling caved in." And Maxine said, "Why did he do that?" And Rita says, "Because he's a nutter. I just hope he survives and ends up coming here, because I am waiting for him." We then cut to the next day, and Janet receives a text message from Craven saying that he wants to see her at the hospital. Will then turns up to work, and he is told that Lou Kelly will be back later today. Jake arrives at Sinclair to see Vera. He is escorted to her room, and Jake gives Vera a big hug. "It's so good to finally see you, Vera," says Jake. And Vera says, "You too." Jake then says, "So, what's happening next for you now, Vera?" And Vera says, "Well, I'm staying here for the foreseeable future at the moment. The doctors want to be sure that I don't have a relapse. But Jake, there's something I want to talk to you about." And as Vera says this, Joan comes into the room and locks the door. Jake turns around and sees Joan, wearing a blonde wig. And Jake is like, "What the fuck?" Joan then says, "Hello, Jake." Jake then looks back at Vera and says, "What the hell is going on here, Vera?" And Vera says, "Look, Jake, don't panic. Joan has been helping me." Jake says, "Oh, I bet she is." Joan then says, "Look, Jake, I'm not here to cause any problems." And Jake tells Joan to get fucked. "I don't trust you an inch, Ferguson." Jake then laughs to himself and says, "Do you know what, Ferguson? You're the only person who I know can come back from the dead, not once, but fucking twice." Vera then says, "Listen to me, Jake. Joan has saved me twice now." And Jake says, "What do you mean? You knew that she was alive, didn't you?" And Vera says, "Look, Jake, Joan saved my life in that explosion. Anne was attacking me and trying to kill me, and Joan saved me and carried me to safety. Of course I wasn't going to tell anyone. I owe her at least that much, Jake." Jake says, "You owe her nothing, Vera. What's the matter with you?" And Vera says, "Look, Jake, Joan has a plan to get me out of here and out of the country." And Jake then says, "Well, now I know why they've locked you up in here, because you're nuts." And Vera says, "Listen to me, Jake. Joan is going to get some fake passports for me, Grace, and you." Jake pauses and looks at Vera in silence. Jake then gets up off the chair and walks around the room. "This is crazy, Vera. We can't go on the run. Every time I tried to get us to go on a run in the past, you've always said no." And Vera says, "Yes, I know, Jake." And Jake says, "So what's changed then, Vera? Why now?" Vera then says, "Because I'm pregnant, Jake. I'm pregnant with your baby." And both Jake and Joan's mouths drop in disbelief. Janet is at the hospital visiting Craven. Janet goes up to his bedside and says, "What do you want?" And Craven says, "You really need to work on your bedside manner, Janet." And Janet says, "Look, Craven, I'm going to be late for my shift. What is it that you want?" Craven asks Janet if Connors has returned to Wentworth yet, and Janet says yes, she came back yesterday evening, and she keeps spouting on about you killing Mitchell. And Craven then says, "I thought she might." Janet then says, "So, when are you getting out of here then?" And Craven says, "Not for a couple of days," which brings me on to why I asked you to come here. I want you to kill Connors. And Janet says, "What?" Craven says, "You heard me. I want Connors dead, and you are going to do it."